Hi there. Welcome back to Haunting Vales. Today, we are going to talk about The Man with Two Graves, a Sherlock Holmes mystery that a tale of shadows and deception, where every clue leads to another question and every grave hides more than just bones. Stay with me as we step into the fog-draped streets of London and follow the unmatched mind of Sherlock Holmes through a puzzle that defies reason and challenges even the sharpest eye for truth. Chapter 1. A Shadow over Highgate. London was wrapped in its usual cloak of damp fog when the mystery first drifted across our threshold at Baker Street. I had returned late from an evening lecture at St. Bartholomew's, the October chill, still clinging to my coat, when I found Holmes seated by the fire, his violin discarded at his side, his piercing gaze fixed upon an envelope on the mantelpiece. His thin fingers tapped the arm of his chair in that restless rhythm I had come to associate with the arrival of something unusual. "Read it aloud, Watson," he said without preamble, his voice sharp, tinged with suppressed excitement. I obeyed. The letter, written in a spidery hand upon thick stationery bearing the crest of Highgate Cemetery, contained a most curious account. The keeper of the grounds, Mr. Edwin Faraday, reported the discovery of an impossible anomaly: two coffins, recently unearthed after a storm had torn at the earth, bore the same name, one Daniel Ashcroft. More disquieting still, the bodies within appeared to be identical, both unmistakably the same man, one freshly buried within the week, the other interred decades prior. The matter, so grotesque in its implications, might have been dismissed as clerical confusion were it not for Faraday's final plea. "Mr. Holmes, I beg your discretion. There are whispers among my men that the dead walk at Highgate. My post and reputation are in jeopardy. If there is trickery, expose it. If something darker, heaven preserve us both." I looked up from the letter, the firelight flickering across Holmes's hawk-like features. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Watson, you see the singularity, do you not? A man cannot die twice, yet here he lies in duplicate. The question is not whether Daniel Ashcroft is dead, but rather, who profits from his having two graves?" His eyes glimmered with a light I had seen before, that razor's edge between science and the uncanny, where Holmes's genius most thrived. The following morning, we were conveyed by hansom cab to Highgate, its avenues lined with leaning angels and ivy-strangled monuments. The air was damp with autumn rot, carrying the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. Mr. Faraday met us at the gates, his face pale beneath his bowler hat. He guided us past rows of weathered stones until we came upon a section of disturbed earth, where two open coffins lay side by side beneath canvas tarpaulins. The first, its oak wood fresh and gleaming, bore a brass plate inscribed Daniel Ashcroft, 1852 to 1891. Within lay the body of a man in his late 30s, his features still recognizable, though touched with the waxy pallor of recent death. The second coffin, its wood splintered with age, carried an identical plate, the dates reading 1812 to 1845. Yet the corpse inside, though shriveled and darkened by time, bore the same angular jaw, the same scar across the left brow, the same unmistakable face that, I confess, my medical training provided me no rational explanation. The features were too precisely aligned for coincidence. "Holmes," I whispered, "are we looking at some ghastly trick of nature?" My companion crouched, producing a magnifying lens from his pocket. He examined first one corpse, then the other, his face unreadable. At last, he rose. "No, Watson, not nature, but artifice. Observe the stitching at the collarbone." Both bodies were embalmed, though decades apart, by hands of unusual skill. And yet, there is something off, a pattern repeated, as though both were constructed to resemble the same man. His gaze turned on Faraday. "Tell me, sir, Who was this Daniel Ashcroft? Faraday shifted uneasily, glancing over his shoulder, as though the ivy-clad stones might overhear. A name ill-remembered, Mr. Holmes. A scholar, I am told. A recluse who died childless in 1845. His tomb was long neglected until last week, when another Daniel Ashcroft was buried, some relation perhaps. But the resemblance, Lord save me, it is uncanny. Holmes's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. Uncanny indeed. Mr. Faraday, secure this ground. No further disturbances. Watson and I must make inquiries. Thus began our investigation into the affair of the man with two graves. We traced the trail first to the parish records, where I spent a tedious afternoon combing through brittle registers while Holmes prowled the shelves like a hound. There we found confirmation. Daniel Ashcroft the Elder, a professor of antiquities, buried in 1845. And yet, curiously, the record of his death bore annotations in a later hand, a marginal note. Exhumed, 1850. Reinterred. Holmes tapped the margin with a long finger. Why would a man's body be disturbed 5 years after burial, Watson? Unless someone needed it for a purpose not recorded. That evening, we called upon the residence of the younger Daniel Ashcroft, newly deceased. His widow, a pale and tremulous woman in black lace, received us in a house heavy with drawn curtains and mourning crepe. Mrs. Ashcroft described her husband as a man of scholarly bent, much like his supposed ancestor. He had devoted his final years to the study of ancient rites of preservation, Egyptian, Babylonian, even arcane European traditions. His library, she said, was filled with volumes of anatomy and esoteric lore. He had died suddenly, struck down by what physicians called heart failure. Yet Holmes's questions lingered on the peculiar. Had her husband spoken of his ancestor? Had he ever hinted at strange experiments? Her eyes brimmed with tears as she nodded. Yes, he often said he was close to uncovering a family secret. He believed his bloodline held knowledge the world was not ready to accept. When we departed, Holmes's mood was grave. Watson, we are dealing not with a simple duplication, but with a legacy, an inheritance of obsession that spans generations. Two men of the same name, separated by half a century, yet united in visage and pursuit. The question remains, how does one man's grave produce two bodies? It was not until the following day, in the lamplight of Baker Street, that the first true glimmer of the solution revealed itself. Holmes spread before me two sketches he had drawn from memory of the corpses. See here, the scar above the left brow. Identical. And yet, its stitching differs. The elder wound is jagged, healed. In life. The younger? A perfect imitation, sewn into the flesh after death. These, Watson, are not two lives, but one model. Repeated, copied, preserved. His eyes blazed with cold fire. We stand on the threshold of something monstrous. Someone has sought to defy time itself, to replicate man beyond his years. The graves are but the surface of a design far darker. Outside, the fog pressed thick against the windows, and a church bell tolled the hour. In that moment, I confess, a chill gripped my heart. For if Holmes was correct, then we were not merely investigating a crime of forgery or deceit, but trespassing upon the very sanctity of the human form. And somewhere in London, hidden among its gaslit streets and shadowed libraries, a mind had labored for decades to perfect the art of creating a man twice buried, and perhaps not yet finished. Chapter 2: A Legacy of Shadows. The days that followed our unsettling visit to Highgate passed in a strange twilight of inquiry and unease, as though London itself had grown aware of the anomaly we pursued. The fog thickened, curling in, pale skeins through Baker Street, muffling the hoofbeats of passing cabs, while Holmes threw himself into the case with a fervor that made even Lestrade's most pressing investigations pale in comparison. He scoured records, rifled through musty tomes of genealogy and science, and sent me hurrying across the city with notes to obscure scholars and antiquarians who owed him favors from cases long past. More than once I returned to find him pacing, like a caged wolf, his eyes glittering in that peculiar light of discovery balanced on the edge of dread. "Watson," he would murmur without looking up, "the dead should remain as they are. Yet in this matter, someone has meddled with the finality of death itself, and meddled with skill enough to confound even my instruments. This is no charlatan's trick, but the work of a mind as cold and methodical as a surgeon's blade." Our inquiries led us first to the library of the British Museum, where we secured permission to consult the Ashcroft papers, dusty folders of correspondence, lecture notes, and half-finished manuscripts once belonging to the elder Daniel Ashcroft, the professor of antiquities buried in 1845. There, beneath the domed silence of that vast reading room, we unearthed fragments that hinted at a darker current beneath his scholarship. Amidst the treatises on Babylonian funerary urns and Egyptian hieroglyphs, we discovered notes scrawled in the margins, diagrams of human anatomy juxtaposed with symbols of alchemical origin, references to the preservation of essence beyond corruption, and the mirror of flesh across the ages. Holmes copied these passages into his notebook with grim precision. "Observe, Watson," he whispered, tapping one page where Ashcroft had written in a cramped hand. "The body is but a vessel. With art and patience, it may be repeated, perfected, reborn." He closed the book sharply. This was no ordinary antiquarian, but a man obsessed with the boundaries between history and eternity. The younger Ashcroft, we learned, had followed a similar course. His widow, when pressed further, confessed that his late-night studies often ended with him locking himself into a small attic room above his library, from which strange odors would drift, chemical, acrid, mingled with something coppery that she dared not name. When she once questioned him, he replied with a feverish gleam that he was on the brink of restoring the family's rightful inheritance. She had thought it the ramblings of a scholar drunk on his books. Now, in the cold light of her mourning, her words carried the weight of dreadful meaning. Holmes resolved that we must see this attic chamber for ourselves. Under cover of evening, with the widow's reluctant consent, we ascended the narrow stairs to that forbidden room. The door creaked open upon a laboratory that chilled even my seasoned physician's nerves. Glass retorts and jars lined the shelves, their contents cloudy and opaque, some containing fragments I could not bear to examine closely. On a heavy oak table lay scalpels, forceps, and needles finer than any I had seen, beside notebooks filled with diagrams of human musculature painstakingly copied and recopied. Yet the most striking object was a waxen cast of a human face, so lifelike that in the lamplight it seemed to breathe. I started back with an involuntary exclamation, but Holmes only leaned close, studying it with narrowed eyes. "The scar," he murmured, "reproduced precisely. Watson, this is not merely study, it is rehearsal." Amidst the clutter we found a locked trunk, which the widow allowed Holmes to force open. Inside lay documents older still, yellowed letters bound with twine, sealed with the crest of the elder Ashcroft. In them we read of experiments conducted in secrecy, of cadavers procured at great expense, of a quest to prove that the body could be recreated like a manuscript, copied faithfully, scar and all, across generations. One phrase recurred like a refrain: "The man with two graves shall walk again." Holmes's expression grew darker with each page. At last he thrust the papers aside. "Watson, we are not dealing with coincidence, but with continuity. The elder Ashcroft conceived the idea. The younger endeavored to complete it. The two bodies at Highgate are not merely kinsmen, but iterations, successive attempts to preserve and replicate a single form, a single identity." I confess, my medical mind recoiled. "Holmes, are you suggesting these men sought to manufacture duplicates of themselves?" It is impossible, beyond the reach of modern science. He turned his gaze upon me, cold and unwavering. Impossible, perhaps, to achieve in full, but not impossible to attempt. What we have seen in those coffins are the relics of obsession bodies, embalmed, altered, made to resemble one another so precisely that they mock the natural order. Whether successful or not, the intent is clear: to cheat time, to defy the grave. The following morning, Holmes received a visitor who cast yet more shadows upon the affair. A gaunt man in clerical dress, Reverend Elias Channing, sought our counsel. He had been a close acquaintance of the younger Ashcroft, and he spoke in hushed tones of strange confessions made by the deceased. Mr. Holmes, he believed himself pursued, not by men, but by destiny. He told me more than once that his family bore a covenant, a pact to preserve knowledge forbidden by heaven. He feared that when his work was complete, it would not end with him. Channing's hands trembled as he clasped his Bible. He asked me whether the soul resides in the flesh, and if so, whether it could be transferred like a candle's flame. I told him such thoughts were blasphemy, but he only smiled, as though he knew something I did not. Holmes listened intently, then asked but one question. Reverend, did he ever speak of others, associates, confidants, men who might share his pursuit? Channing hesitated, then nodded. Yes, a society of sorts. Antiquarians, physicians, men of letters. They met in secret under the name the Custodians. I thought it harmless debate. Now I am not so certain. That revelation sent Holmes into one of his rare frenzies of deduction. He paced our rooms for hours, smoking pipe after pipe, his thoughts racing faster than my pen could record. A society, Watson. Think of it. Men scattered across London, united by a doctrine of preservation, of duplication. If the Ashcrofts were but two faces of this larger design, then the true author of the work may yet live, hidden in plain sight. The bodies at Highgate are but the surface scratches upon a vast structure buried beneath our city. He halted, suddenly, his eyes gleaming. We must seek them out, and I know where to begin. That evening found us in the reading room of a private society on Russell Square, where Holmes, under the guise of a visiting scholar, gained access to the membership rolls. By flickering gaslight, we scanned the names: surgeons, embalmers, antiquarians, all respectable men of standing. Yet Holmes's finger paused upon one name in particular, written in an elegant hand: Dr. Julian Harrow. Mark this well, Watson. Harrow was cited in the younger Ashcroft's correspondence. He is still living and reputed to be a master of preservation techniques. If anyone could guide or misguide the Ashcrofts, it is he. Our attempt to confront Dr. Harrow proved fruitless at first, for his residence in Bloomsbury was shuttered, the windows dark. But as we turned away down the narrow street, Holmes's keen eyes caught movement. A figure slipping through a side door, robed in black, carrying a satchel long and narrow. Without hesitation, we gave chase, through twisting alleys and across cobblestones slick with rain. At last the figure vanished into a courtyard littered with crates and barrels, and there we found, abandoned in haste, the satchel itself. Within lay surgical instruments gleaming with recent use, and beneath them, a folded sheaf of papers. By lamplight, Holmes read them aloud. Instructions for the preparation of flesh, the preservation of scars, and, most chillingly, a ledger of names and dates. Many were crossed out, but at the bottom, newly written, stood the name Daniel Ashcroft, with two entries, one dated 1845, the other 1891. Holmes's jaw tightened as he refolded the papers. Watson, we are close upon the architect of this dreadful enterprise. The Ashcrofts were but subjects, chosen, perhaps bred, to carry the likeness forward. But Harrow, or whomever leads these custodians, intends to carry the work yet further. The man with two graves may not be the end, but the beginning. We Returned to Baker Street that night weary but unbowed, the city's gas lamps hissing in the damp mist. As I recorded the day's findings, Holmes stood at the window, his silhouette stark against the gloom. "Watson," he said softly, "in all my years of inquiry, I have sought the truth in crime, in deceit, in the follies of men. But this is something deeper. It is not merely crime, but heresy against the order of life and death. We must tread carefully, for those who seek to master the grave will not hesitate to send others into it." And so the mystery deepened, the shadows lengthening around us, as if London itself held its breath. The man with two graves was no longer a riddle confined to Highgate, but the sign of a design stretching back generations and reaching forward with cold, relentless purpose. Where it would lead us, neither Holmes nor I yet dared to guess. Chapter 3: The Custodian's Secret. The third stage of our investigation into the dreadful matter of the man with two graves began with the name Dr. Julian Harrow, yet quickly unfurled into something vaster than either Holmes or I anticipated. The fog of London seemed thicker than usual that week, its coils of white pressing heavily upon Baker Street, as if the city itself sought to keep hidden the secrets buried in its heart. Holmes spent long hours in silence, poring over the papers. Recovered from Harrow's satchel, each page dense with anatomical sketches, alchemical symbols, and instructions written in a hand precise to the point of obsession. He read them not merely as a physician would, but as a detective divining motive from the smallest flourish of ink. When at last he spoke, his voice was flat, almost brittle. "Watson, this is no mere student's exercise in anatomy. These instructions are a manifesto. Note how every line returns to one principle: preservation, duplication, replication. And look here, each scar, each imperfection, faithfully transcribed and repeated, as though to convince the eye that two bodies are one. Do you see, my friend? The intent is not perfection, but imitation. Not to create something new, but to forge a mirror of what already was." I leaned closer, my stomach nodding as I examined the ledger of names. The pattern was unmistakable. Families long interred in Highgate, Kensal Green, and Brompton, names crossed out one by one, with annotations beside them: successful, failure, repeat. And always, at intervals across decades, the same name, Daniel Ashcroft. I confess, I shivered as I read it aloud. Holmes. It is as though this Ashcroft were the cornerstone of their design, a figure they must replicate again and again. My companion nodded grimly. Precisely. The Ashcrofts were not merely participants, but chosen vessels. The reason remains unclear, but I suspect we shall soon learn why this family, above all others, was bound to the scheme. Holmes's first course of action was to draw closer to Harrow, but not by direct confrontation. Instead, he contrived a disguise as a visiting lecturer from Edinburgh, well-versed in preservation techniques, and through certain letters of introduction secured access to a gathering of scholars that we suspected was none other than the clandestine custodians. Circle. I accompanied him, albeit in a less prominent guise, posing as his medical assistant. The meeting was held in a private hall off Russell Square, a place whose windows were shrouded with heavy velvet curtains and whose entrance was guarded by a man of unsmiling aspect. Inside, beneath the glow of gas lamps, we found perhaps 24 men assembled: physicians, antiquarians, men of science and letters. Their demeanor was sober, their conversation hushed, but there was a fervor in their eyes, a quiet zeal that unsettled me far more than any outburst might have done. At the head of the gathering stood Harrow himself, tall and cadaverous, with a narrow face sharpened by spectacles and hair brushed back from a high, gleaming brow. His voice, when he spoke, was soft yet commanding, carrying to every corner of the room. "Gentlemen, we meet once more to pursue the great work. Though our brother Ashcroft is lost to us, His sacrifice has not been in vain. The path he opened we shall continue, until the vessel is perfected, until no grave may hold what we choose to endure. A murmur of assent rippled through the assembly. Holmes's eyes glittered beneath his disguise. Though he gave no outward sign of his thoughts, the evening unfolded with a series of presentations, papers read aloud, diagrams displayed. Upon easels, discussions of embalming fluids and ancient rituals of preservation. To an uninitiated listener, it might have seemed a learned society dedicated to morbid but harmless inquiry. Yet beneath their clinical language lay a thread of purpose, unmistakable and chilling. That the human form was malleable, that identity could be sculpted, that death itself might be cheated by careful craft. When Harrow produced a waxen mask, molded with such fidelity that it seemed a living face, several members applauded softly, their eyes alight with admiration. I could scarce restrain my disgust. At the close of the meeting, Harrow announced that a more select gathering would be held the following night at his residence in Bloomsbury, to which only certain members were invited. Holmes, having played his role convincingly, was among them. As we departed into the misty square, Holmes whispered, "Watson, tomorrow we stand at the threshold. The custodians will reveal to their inner circle that which they conceal from the outer. Steel yourself, for we may see sights that test the very bounds of reason." The following evening, under cover of our assumed identities, we arrived at Harrow's house, a narrow, austere structure with shuttered windows and a door of heavy oak. Inside, the atmosphere was altogether different from the previous night. No longer the semblance of academic decorum, but a secrecy that bordered on the ritualistic. A half-dozen men gathered in a chamber lit by a single chandelier, its light casting long shadows upon the walls. At the center stood a table draped in black cloth, upon which lay a coffin. My heart quickened, for though it was closed, the implication was unmistakable. Harrow addressed us in solemn tones. "Brothers, tonight we honor Ashcroft. We honor him not in mourning, but in continuation. His likeness has been preserved. His form, though claimed by the grave, remains our template. Observe." At his signal, two attendants drew back the lid of the coffin. Within lay a body, pale, waxen, yet horribly lifelike. The features were those of the younger Ashcroft, though smoother, preserved against decay. The scar upon the brow was there, as faithfully replicated as in the coffins at Highgate. Gasps escaped the assembly, though not of horror, but of reverence. Harrow's voice rose. "Here lies the proof. Man need not vanish into dust. With craft and devotion, the form persists, repeated, perfected. And so long as form endures, essence may yet follow. We are but steps from the final revelation." I confess, I felt a chill colder than any I had known, for in that moment it seemed we stood not among men of science, but among zealots who worshipped a false resurrection. Holmes, ever master of his emotions, leaned toward me and whispered almost imperceptibly, "Note, Watson, the stitching at the jawline, the artifice of the eyes. This is not life, but simulation. And yet, they believe. That belief is their power and their danger." The meeting concluded with vows spoken in low voices, hands laid upon the coffin as though it were an altar. Then Harrow dismissed us, warning that further works would soon commence, works that required utmost secrecy. Holmes and I departed into the damp night, the fog curling thick around us, the lamps glowing dim through its veil. For a long while he said nothing, his face set in grim lines. At last he spoke. "Watson, the custodians are not merely antiquarians dabbling in morbid curiosity. They are conspirators in a heresy against nature itself. Their aim is not only to preserve the likeness of Ashcroft, but to carry forward some essence they believe inheres in that likeness. Whether they succeed or not is immaterial. The danger lies in their devotion and in the lengths to which they will go." Back at Baker Street, We pored once more over the recovered ledger. Holmes tapped his finger upon the 2 entries for Daniel Ashcroft. 2 graves, 2 bodies, 2 attempts. But the ledger does not end here. Look, there is space left awaiting. A 3rd entry. The custodians will not cease. They intend another duplication, perhaps even now. We must discover where and when, before their design is completed. He rose abruptly, pacing the room. Watson, I suspect that Harrow's invitation tonight was no accident. He wished to measure us, to see if we were fit to join his inner circle. We must play the part, for only within their trust can we learn the site of their next attempt. Until then, we are at great risk. Should they suspect us, I do not doubt they would consign us to graves of our own. That night I slept but little, haunted by the memory of the waxen face in the coffin, so lifelike and yet so utterly void of life. I dreamed of walking through Highgate, the graves yawning open, each containing not bones but replicas, endless ranks of Ashcrofts staring upward with sightless eyes. I awoke in a sweat to find Holmes already at work, his violin lying silent as he bent over maps and notes, tracing connections between cemeteries, laboratories, and members of the custodian's circle. His eyes, when they met mine, were weary, but fierce. Courage, Watson. The game is afoot in earnest now. We pursue not a murderer alone, but an entire society devoted to defying the grave. And I fear the next move will bring us closer to death than we have ever trod. And thus the curtain rose upon the next act of our dreadful drama, with London itself as the stage, its fog-draped streets concealing both ally and enemy, and the custodians moving in the shadows like players in a ritual older and darker than science. The man with 2 graves was but their herald. The true revelation lay ahead, waiting in silence, patient as the grave itself. Chapter 4. The Cipher in the Ledger. The autumn fog had settled heavy across London, draping Baker Street in a veil of silence. The gas lamps glowed faintly, their halos swallowed by the mist. Inside 221B, Sherlock Holmes leaned over his cluttered desk, the glow of a single oil lamp falling across a pile of documents, ledgers, letters, and half-burnt scraps of paper that Inspector Lestrade had grudgingly turned over earlier that day. The fire in the hearth crackled faintly, but even its warmth seemed unable to chase away the peculiar chill that had followed us since our discovery in the cemetery. Holmes's eyes, sharp and hawk-like, flicked back and forth as he scanned each line of figures in the ledger. His long, pale fingers tapped the surface of the desk in a rhythm only he could understand. I sat nearby, pen in hand, ready to record his deductions but careful not to disturb his concentration. Outside, the muffled sound of carriage wheels occasionally broke the silence, only to fade back into the oppressive stillness of the fog. Holmes finally looked up. "Watson," he said, his voice calm yet tinged with an undercurrent of excitement. "Our so-called banker, Mr. Charles Redgrave, is not merely engaged in matters of finance. These numbers, seemingly ordinary deposits and withdrawals, hide a most curious code." I rose from my chair and leaned closer. At first glance, the ledger contained nothing unusual. Columns of figures, initials beside them, dates spanning the last 3 years. But Holmes pointed with his pencil at the sequence of entries. "Do you see it?" he asked. I shook my head, confessing my ignorance. With a thin smile, he continued, "Every 7th entry begins with the same initials, TG. But observe more carefully. The amounts, though different, form a sequence. Multiples of 7, Watson. It is a cipher hidden in the numbers." His voice dropped as he leaned closer to the firelight. "And when one applies the simplest transposition, the initials and numbers spell out a name, Thomas Gray." The words hung heavy in the air. Thomas Gray was the name etched upon one of the gravestones, the second grave we had discovered, untouched yet unsettling in its mystery. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Holmes," I murmured. Are you suggesting that the man buried there, or rather, the man who is supposed to be buried there, is alive? Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. Not merely alive, Watson. He is moving money, significant sums, through channels meant to look like ordinary banking transactions. And he is doing so under the cover of Charles Redgrave, who either is complicit or is being manipulated. He paused, his eyes narrowing. The truth, however, lies deeper. There are two graves, two names, and one man at the center. We must now determine which identity is genuine and which is the mask. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression uneasy. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said softly. Behind her appeared Inspector Lestrade, his coat damp from the fog, his brow furrowed. He wasted no time. "Holmes, we've had reports from the docks. A shipment of coffins, unclaimed, unloaded at midnight and carted away by men no one can identify. The dockmaster swears he saw Redgrave himself there, overseeing the removal." Holmes rose instantly, his eyes gleaming. "Watson, do you hear? Graves above ground, coffins unclaimed, and a banker who traffics in both numbers and death. The pattern emerges." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "But Holmes, coffins are delivered to undertakers every day. What makes this different?" Holmes stepped closer to him, speaking with quiet conviction. "Because, Lestrade, coffins are meant to hold the dead. Yet in this case, they may be holding the living, or worse, something meant to disguise the truth of identity. A man cannot die twice, and yet the evidence suggests that one has." The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to pause its crackle. I could not help but glance at the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. Holmes returned to his desk, his fingers rifling quickly through the pages of the ledger once more. He pulled out a folded letter that had been tucked between the entries. Opening it carefully, he revealed a short message, scrawled in an unsteady hand. "The second grave is not empty. It waits." The words chilled me to the bone. Lestrade muttered an oath under his breath, while Holmes's face hardened into an expression of grim satisfaction. "So," he whispered, "the architect of this scheme has revealed his hand. Not through carelessness, but through design. We are meant to discover this, Watson. We are being drawn into the game." He stood abruptly, snatching his hat and coat from the stand. "Come. The cemetery will not wait for daylight. The truth of the second grave must be uncovered before the night is out." And so, with the fog curling around us like a shroud, we followed Holmes back into the London night, toward the graves that bore two names but one shadow, an enigma only beginning to unfold. Chapter 5: Shadows at Dawn. The pale light of morning seeped into Baker Street, filtered by fog that clung stubbornly to the city. Holmes sat by the fire, the familiar silhouette of his frame sharp against the flames. He held in his hands the final pages of Inspector Gregson's report, an account of the exhumed coffin, the man with two graves, and the plot that had spiraled far beyond mere deception. For a long time, Holmes said nothing. His pipe had gone cold, and only the quiet ticking of the clock filled the silence. At last he spoke. "Watson," he began, his voice low but cutting, "this was never about a grave. It was about power. Men such as Ravenshaw build empires on secrets, and secrets, when buried, are never truly at rest." I listened intently, for Holmes's tone carried that weight it bore only after the end of his most testing cases. The trail of the man with two graves had wound through deceit, counterfeit death, betrayal of family, and the shadow of money stretching over generations. But now, as Holmes pieced the puzzle together, one truth became inescapable. Death had been used as a mask, and behind it lay the true face of ambition. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing into the fog. "Consider the audacity," he continued, "to live with one foot in the grave and the other firmly on the neck of those who trusted him. Ravenshaw forged his own death not once, but twice, playing the world as his stage. He tapped the glass lightly with a finger. But no man, Watson, not even Ravenshaw, can outwit truth forever. His words lingered as if directed not at me, but at the dawn itself. The shadows of night retreated, yet they left behind their lesson, that the dead do not always remain where they are laid, and the living sometimes cling to the grave as if it were sanctuary. When Gregson delivered the final verdict at Scotland Yard later that morning, the official spoke in hushed tones. The matter was officially closed, though no officer present could entirely shake the feeling that Ravenshaw's ghost still lingered in the chambers of London. Holmes, however, dismissed the talk of haunting. "There are no ghosts," he declared with his characteristic firmness. "Only men who wear their shadows too convincingly." Yet even he, I noticed, did not appear wholly convinced. That night, when I found him sitting again by the fire, his violin untouched, he seemed unusually quiet. Perhaps, I thought, he too felt the weight of a man who had tried to live twice and failed at both attempts in the end. The case of the man with two graves faded from the newspapers. London moved on, as it always does, eager for the next scandal, the next sensation. But to those of us who had seen the truth, its echo would not die so easily. Holmes closed the matter in his records with a single line in his spidery handwriting. The man who sought immortality through deception found only his second and final grave. And so it ended. Yet, as I pen these words, I cannot help but feel that the story lingers, like smoke that clings to one's coat long after the fire has gone out. It is in these cases, the ones that unsettle us long after their conclusion, that Holmes's brilliance shines brightest. He unearths not only crime, but the frailty of human nature itself. That is so, dear listener, if mysteries such as this hold you in their grasp, if you find yourself drawn into the fog-draped streets of Victorian London where shadows whisper and secrets breathe, then stay with us. For this is but one of many tales from the casebooks of Sherlock Holmes, tales of deceit, ambition, and truth that claw their way to the surface. Make sure you follow along for the next journey into the unknown, where Holmes's sharp mind and unerring logic will once again peel back the veil of darkness. Until then, remember, mysteries never sleep, and the shadows always return at dawn.